Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. If you haven't been here before, my name's Jamie Fenn, and today we're going to talk about color grading in Davinci Resolve. Now, I actually just put out a LUT Pack. It's available for download in the description. There is also a freebie down there, so go ahead, check it out. If you like it, buy the pack. I'd really appreciate it. It would help me continue to make videos like this, and it would also give you a really cool look on your videos. Now, today I'm going to show you all the things I wish I knew before I started color grading. I've been researching for the last couple years, and I've watched a ton of tutorials. I read the manual, and there's a ton of tools out there, but I'm going to show you the best way to get a good fundamental color grade on all of your videos. Color correction and color grading is basically making video clips, motion pictures, and still images kind of match with the white point, the black point, so the highlights and the shadows, and also kind of balancing the contrast, the saturation, the colors, and making sure everything looks pretty even. And that will pretty much make your whole video look like one big cohesive piece of artwork. Now here's the Ansel Adams zone system here. It's a good reference in case you need to know how to kind of grade the luminance on the waveform here and the scopes. So every image, every photo, every video that you have, you never want to go below 0, and you don't typically want to push over 10, and 10 being like 1023 here, 0 being here. Use this as like a reference. It's really good for when you're trying to color grade, especially if you're starting out. And then once you practice more and more, you'll get the hang of it. So when I'm done editing and cutting the clips, what I typically like to do is come to the first clip and set up a node tree to look something like this. We're going to start with white balance, then we're going to go to contrast, do some color balance if it needs it, add saturation, and then finally sharpness. And I don't know if the free Davinci has film grain, so that'll be optional. If you don't have anything in here to start with, which I don't think you do when it's default, what I like to do as a shortcut is hold down either Alt or Option depending on what kind of computer you're on, and push S, and that will automatically enter in serial nodes. So put in 5 nodes, click on the first node, click on node label, rename it to white balance, rename the second one, third one, fourth, and fifth. And then once you do that, what I like to typically do is select all the other clips and apply the grade, because then when you go to any other clip, it will have kind of like this layout set up for you, and it'll get you through the color grading process a little bit quicker, so you don't have to, readjust every single node, and you don't have to, rename it. Another thing is like it's really important to kind of try to remember when you shoot something what kind of profile you shot it in, whether it was vlog or raw or a right off your cell phone, and kind of know what type of file you're working with. I typically like to try to shoot in the flattest profile possible that the camera has to offer, and I like to turn the sharpness and the noise reduction, if your camera has it, all the way down, because I like to have as much creative freedom in post-production as possible. Let's start off with just doing a basic grade on a clip. I'm not going to use a LUT at first, and then I'll show you how to use a LUT. So this is my friend and I just chilling, going down the river on our paddle boards. And I'm gonna look down here. I'm gonna come down to the scopes and turn on the waveform. Now the waveform is the luminance, the brightness of the whole channel, of the whole video. And I'm gonna click on white balance, and the easiest way, what I like to do, especially if you have something pure white in your shot, is come down to this eyedropper tool, which is the white balance selector, and just click on something that is white. Now that'll pretty much fix the white balance for your video. Then what I like to do in the same node is actually bring down the highlights a little bit, and then bring up the shadows. because if I go like this, you can see I'm obviously crushing the blacks, and that looks terrible. And you can see that they are clipping a little bit, so I'm gonna bring this up just a little bit. And as we go through the nodes here, we will eventually push these highlights up and bring the shadows down just by the corrections that we do. We can also adjust the shadows and the highlights by coming to our color wheels here and pulling the slider left and right, but I typically like to use the curves. I also like using these primary bars for the color correction because when you use these wheels, it's kind of hard to work with. And when you have a mouse, it's really nice to just kind of pull the colors up and down as you need. So the next thing we want to do for the shot is add some contrast. Now there's two ways that I primarily do this. The first is using the curves and just applying a simple S curve like that. And then the other way is coming down to the number 1 here, and you see where it says contrast. I like to just kind of turn this up until the image looks pretty good as far as contrast. And as we do these corrections, like I said, you have to look at this waveform because it will push through eventually when you start adding saturation and, you know, contrast. So next I'm going to move on to the color balance. And for that, I'm going to click on Parade and kind of just see where the image sits with the RGB. And there's, for every pixel in a video, there's red, green, and blue. And I'm looking here, and it looks like this is a pretty well balanced image. Honestly, like I don't think that needs much. I'm gonna crank up the saturation just to kind of see where the colors go. And for saturation, I typically like to look at the vector scope. You don't want to go outside. At least personally, this is what I do. I make like an imaginary line connecting the colors here. And if the color of the trace of your video goes outside of that, it's kind of too much. You know, I could sit here and do that and it could be borderline okay, but just to me that looks a little oversaturated, so I'm gonna back off on that. I'll probably go down to like 70. Also, I'm keeping in mind if I want to add a LUT to the overall look of this whole video that I'm creating, which right now is just a bunch of random clips. I will add a LUT and it'll be a look LUT. It'll add like a style, but it may pump a little bit more saturation in places. And I want to be careful that I don't go outside of this. So I'm just going to keep the saturation at like 70. Now, I know that my GoPro had no sharpness on, so I do want to come over to the sharpness node and click on the blur sharpen tool. Make sure I select sharpen and bring down the sharpness. Now, if you go too much, I mean, it obviously looks like crap. So I typically never go below like 45. And that looks like a pretty well balanced clip. I really didn't have to do anything with the color balance for this shot specifically, so I'm going to leave it at that. Okay, so let's move on to a video that I'm going to use a LUT on. So here we have a close-up of the Ronin S with the GH5 on it, and pretty much it's almost like Blackmagic Cinema DNG almost looks black and white at some points because like it's such a flat image, but there is so much detail to recover. So I'm gonna add a LUT to this one and work with it, and I'll show you how I work with LUTs, because a LUT is not just like a slap on one and done kind of thing. And keep in mind, this is not kind of like a styled look LUT. This is a LUT to get your flat image to a, or as close to a Rec 709 color space. So what I typically like to do is keep all these adjustments before the LUT and put the LUT after. So I select saturation, hold down Alt S, right click, and there's a good LUT by this company called Ground Control, and they have it for free on their website along with other LUTs. And as you can see, it's a pretty good starting point, but there are some adjustments that we need to make. First, I like to always come down to the white balance and kind of bring down the highlights just to see what happens. Also, what's great with Blackmagic RAW or Cinema DNG or just having any RAW file format is you can come over to the Camera Raw tab and make sure by default, it is on project. Selecting clip and clicking highlight recovery, you do get back some of this detail. This was actually properly exposed, but I'll show you another shot where it actually makes a huge difference. Okay, I'm gonna select the white balance real quick, come over to our color wheels and select the eyedropper tool and select the Ronin logo because I know that's as close to pure white in the shot as I'll be able to find. I'll also want to bring down the shadows a little bit and maybe bring up the highlights just a tiny bit. And as you can see, like when I do something in here, it's kind of doing it inside the LUT. Like if I bring up the, see how that's kind of affecting it already? There's kind of like some type of roll off in this LUT, but I'm gonna keep it like right there because nothing is super pure bright white in this shot. There's no like sunshine. And I'm keeping in mind that Ansel Adams graph in my head while I'm doing this. So as far as color balance goes, oh, looks like there's some type of clipping here. I will kind of sometimes bring down the trace and look and see what is out of balance. So what I mean by that is kind of like bringing this up and noticing the red kind of touches this line first. The blue and the green may need some adjustment. So I'm going to come over to the color balance node. And I want to make sure the luma mix is turned down so that way when I pull a color, it doesn't affect the other colors as much. So I will bring down the lift a little bit here and also bring down the green. That actually kind of lifts the other colors. And maybe even push the red just one little bit down. And then also looking over here at the right, the blue looks a little low. So I may pull that up just one little step like that. And that seems to be a pretty good grade. So now when I come back to the waveform, because I always want to use the waveform, honestly, I sometimes get mixed up by using, you know, the parade. So I always have to remind myself to come back and use the waveform to make sure that the shadows and the highlights are correctly balanced. So that looks like a pretty good grade. If I wanted to, I could probably pump some more saturation into it. But for now, this is going to work really well. I love the image quality that comes out of the original Blackmagic. It's amazing. So say you have a clip that you know that you shot in the same exact shooting parameters. So as far as like lighting conditions, the white balance, everything, the exposure is almost identical. What you can do, it's really easy. It's really fun. It's sometimes not the best way to go about grading. There's always going to be adjustments needed when you do this. But say I have this clip here and it's not graded at all. Well, if this shot here is almost identical to lighting conditions, I can click on the clip I want to grade and then right click on the graded clip and click on apply grade. I always keep in mind the waveform. Make sure you're on the white balance and highlight shadow node. I always want to make sure that I don't go beyond 0 and 1023. And these two shots now are pretty much identical, which is really nice. I could maybe add a little bit more contrast in this shot, maybe not, just because the lighting conditions behind it. But if you look at these two, they look really well matched because they basically have the same grade and the color balance and everything is identical. Now I'm going to move on to one more clip here. This is B-Raw. Now this is something I've never really graded before. It's really cool. I'm not going to use a LUT, but I'm going to show you what I'm talking about with the highlight recovery. When you import it, by default, like I said, it is decoded using the project. But for example, say you come in here and you do your grade and you see this giant mess of an overexposed image. Over here, you come to your Blackmagic RAW, click on clip, and then you'll enable your highlight recovery and look how much detail comes back. It's like when you're in Lightroom pulling down the highlights and you get all that detail back. It's incredible. But you still are clipping over here on the waveform. So I do want to pull this down a little bit. Also on the shot here, I can bring down the blacks. And also adjust white balance real quick, which is easy since everything in here is pretty much white. So I will select, you know, the snow here and add some contrast. This time I'm going to use an S curve just because I've been doing it the other way. And then as far as color balance, I think it's pretty good. See how like, it's really well balanced. We're all good here. As far as saturation, we can click on our vector scope and look at the saturation as we go up, and we don't want to crank it too much. We could probably go that far with it, but I typically don't like to oversaturate things. Like I said, sometimes I'll put a final LUT on and give it a good look, and that will increase a little bit of saturation in specific colors. Now, if I wanted to, you know, specifically for this clip, something I've been doing a lot lately is actually coming down to the number 2. I'm going to add a node just somewhere in here. And coming down to the number 2 and actually bringing up the shadows just a little bit. So for like this part here, see how I can bring up the shadows pretty much all the way. But as I do that too, look at the vector scope. It's pushing the colors out really far. So you got to be careful. So I'll do like 30. I mean, the quality of the image is so clean. It really is. When you compare it to like the original Blackmagic, I mean, this is obviously 4K, higher data transfer, higher data rate. It just looks super clean. Like I could take a screenshot, a screen grab of any of these, and it looks amazing. And let's see, one more thing. I don't know. I don't think there's anything actually else to cover besides the fact that I am releasing a LUT pack. It's my Jamie Fenn Pro LUTs for this year, and it's actually a really cool, exciting thing that I'm going to be doing. It'll also help support me running this channel, so I appreciate it if you do support me. It'd be awesome. But I do have a bunch of LUTs that will be available for download in the description below. And essentially what that'll do is it'll essentially create some really cool looks for you for your videos. They're a little bit different than most LUTs, I feel like. I basically just adjusted colors. I never really adjusted the white balance for any of this, so it's really good for like when you have a well-balanced video and you want to add a good look to it. So they are all kind of based for having good skin tones. I think that a lot of LUTs you kind of slap on and they don't think about skin tones, and they kind of just like pump colors into places that you just don't need. You know, if I look at this clip real quick, let's see, if I just did a quick grade just to kind of show you on the skin tones, say if I click on, actually here's like the easiest cheat kind of way to grade a clip is just create a node and come down here and click on A for auto, and it'll somewhat auto balance your whole clip for you. I don't know if it works with like saturation stuff. It kind of looks like it does. But just for the example, I'm going to click on my timeline. By the way, when I apply these LUTs, this is like the most important thing. I typically like to come up here, and instead of clicking on the clip view, there's the timeline view. And then I'll create a node. And when I create a node, it'll affect the whole video. As you can see, the LUTs actually work pretty well. This isn't the best graded clip in the world, but I'll show you some other ones. Let's try Italy. It's kind of like a vintage look, which is kind of nice. And say if you put it on, you're like, wow, that looks not that good. It's like too contrasty. It's crushing all the blacks. You can actually come down to the node key here and crank it down. Just turn the gain down a little bit. And just a little bit goes a long way. I mean, look at this clip here, for example. This is a Mavic Pro shot with Cine D. And so as far as color correction, I'm just going to add some contrast just a tiny bit. And I'm going to show you what this LUT kind of does. Saturation, maybe just a tiny bit. Just like a tiny bit. And look at our waveform, make sure we don't go beyond, which we are. Bring that down. And look at our vector scope. And that looks like it's actually got too much saturation, because when I apply this LUT, it's going to be too much. Pretty well balanced as far as color grading. And then if I slap on a look, the LUT is only up at 0.3, so like 30%. And I typically don't like to use LUTs beyond like 0.5. I think a lot of times people overdo it. I mean, if I had it at full output, I mean, you're playing with danger here on the vector scope. But for example, like I turn this down even to like 0.5, at least for this specific clip. It could affect other clips differently, but that's why it's important to get a well-balanced image. I typically, like I said, like to go to like 30%. And 30% is a huge change in color. And I think the most important thing is when you're color grading and you do your look, you want people to go, oh, that's got a cool style to it. You don't want them to go, oh man, they oversaturated, like they overdid it. Like it obviously looks like there's a color grade and that doesn't look good. Because, you know, you either crank up a LUT too much, you crank the saturation too much. And I like to keep things simple. So that's another example here of one of my LUTs. There will be other ones available here that you don't see, but for example, I put on Dreams. It kind of adds a little bit of a green to the shadows. It's kind of cool. I like the stunting, because what it does is it kind of desaturates things and it's really good on skin tones. It makes you kind of look tan. It makes like orange look tan. Again, I'd really appreciate it if you supported me by getting these LUTs. It would definitely help me. I appreciate all the good feedback and all the people that are appreciating my work. I'll probably do a more advanced color grading tutorial specifically on other little details, but for now, this will get you a good foundation for your projects. Thank you again, and I'll see you in the next one.